Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on good practices. We are broadcasting today from the Interreg Europe Joint Secretariat in Lille. My name is Eilish. With me is Nico. And there are a few colleagues here today, and we are going to take you through everything you need to know about good practices and how to submit them for validation to the program. So I have with me also Verena Priem, who's going to be taking us through the practicalities of the good practice system. And on the back end here we also have our colleagues Etienne and Hassan, who are going to be answering your questions on the chat box today. We also have Josephine, who's supporting us with the technicalities. So a big crew here today, looking forward to discovering your questions and answering them. So basically we're going to move now to the agenda just to explain a bit about what we're going to talk today. First of all, Nico is going to take us through the theory of good practices. So what is a good practice? Why submit one? Who should do it and when? And after that, Verena will join us for how exactly the validation process works. So this means how do you submit one using the online tool and what happens next. After that, we will have some time for questions and answers. And I will tell you in just a moment how you can submit your questions. But first of all, we would like to launch a poll to understand whether or not you're already familiar with the system for submitting good practices. So in just a moment, Josephine is going to launch the poll, and we would like you to answer yes or no whether you've already submitted a good practice. This is really interesting for us to know because some of you may be already involved in different projects and have used the tool before. In this case, you'll be happy to discover some of the updates and new features that might make your life a bit easier. And others of you might be discovering this system for the very first time. So either way, there's a lot of interesting information for you here today. I can see that around 80% of you have not submitted a good practice before. So Nico, we have a lot of newcomers in the audience today who will be eagerly waiting to understand what is a good practice and how to submit one. Before we dive into the content, I'd like to present to you the user dashboard that you have on your screen with GoToWebinar. In particular, you have a box called questions. This is where you can submit your questions to us. We will either answer them live on screen, or else my colleagues may answer them in the chat box in case it's a very specific question. In addition, you can see there's a handout section. So in the handout section, we have 3 documents for you today. First one is the slides that we're going to present so that you can share them with your partners afterwards in case they could not join today. I should mention also that we're recording the webinar and it will be available afterwards on the program website and on YouTube, so you can watch back or share it also. The second document in the handouts is the guidance note that we've prepared for projects on how the validation system works. So this will be very useful for the web administrator to know what their role is in the process, but we will tackle this also later. The third and final document is a Word document template of the good practice submission form. So we know that some of you have been asking, is it possible to maybe prepare the good practice offline before submitting it to the system so that you can share it with your colleagues or approve the text? So this document should be useful for you so that you also have a record of what you submitted. So with that, I think we can move into the content. Nico, I'll pass you this clicker here.
Thank you very much, Eilish. Well, good morning to all also from my side. Welcome to this webinar. We are very happy to see so many participants. 80% didn't submit any good practices yet, so I think hopefully this webinar will be useful for you to understand a bit more, first the theory behind and also the practicalities of the good practice database. The first thing I'd like to say before going in the question on what, who, when, is to tell you that this notion of good practices is a bit fundamental. It's at the heart of what we're doing in Interreg Europe. You know that this program is about not reinventing the wheel, finding good solutions that work in Europe in different fields of regional development. So that's the reason why we attach so much importance to this element of good practices, because this is really the source of knowledge and inspiration that helps projects in a way to improve the regional development policies. So If we go now a bit more in the theory, the idea, starting with what is a good practices and the notion itself of the good practices. Just for your information, you have the complete definition in the program manual in the section on projects, so you can have a look. But this is summarized here on the slide. So it's an initiative which is of course undertaken in one of the program priorities. Which have proven successful, so meaning that has brought concrete results in a territory that has been successful in a way or another, and that you considered as a good source of inspiration maybe for others. Coming back to the definition, when you look at what initiatives means in our world, it's in fact extremely broad. We see methodology, project, process. This is in a way to reflect the richness of our projects. We are financing very different kind of projects. Some projects are, for instance, focusing on how do you better evaluate biodiversity preservation policies. A good practice in such a context may be, for instance, an innovative indicator system to follow this. But we can have also much more focused specialized projects that, for instance, work on how SMEs access to finance, and in such a kind of projects, the good practices that will be identified may be much more specific, a very specific tool that regional development agencies are launching to help their SMEs to better access to finance. So you see, we are very open in this definition, and this has of course to be related to the topic you are addressing in your project, and this has, as I mentioned a bit earlier, have to be a bit successful in what you describe. You have to understand why this is considered as a good practices. Why submit a good practices? Yes, you may wonder, this is the whole aim of today's webinar, huh? Why do we ask you to report this work on the good practices you are doing in your project? And the first element we'd like to highlight there, it's because it's a really great communication opportunity for you. You may already know that all these good practices, when they are assigned to your project, they will be finally published on your project website. And for us, this is very important because Interreg Europe remains sometimes a bit conceptual. When you look at a quick description of a project, okay, they want to improve policies in the domain of energy efficiency in building, well, that's interesting. When you click more precisely on the good practices, then suddenly you understand much better. You have a clearer insight in what the project is doing. So it's a really nice opportunity for you to bring more visibility, to more content on what you are doing, what you are working on inside your cooperation. So this is the first step. The second step, this is a bit the ultimate goal of our work here in Interreg Europe, is that we would hope that at the end what you're doing in your project may also be useful for others in Europe, and that's the reason why we developed the policy learning platform. So we would hope that these good practices sometimes can be a source of inspiration also for other policymakers, other regional development practitioners everywhere in Europe. That's a bit the important also element in the communications. There is a second element in the why, which is perhaps a bit more internal, a bit more administrative, I would say, related to the reporting. I'm sure you remember when you had to draft your application form, you had to complete a certain number of core indicators, core output indicators, and the number of good practices identified is one of them. So the reason why we ask you to report on your good practices, it's because we will use that to monitor, of course, what you're doing, the content, understand better your project, but also very basically to see where you are in relation to this indicator. How many good practice you have identified so far. The policy officers will receive this when you submit it, they will be notified, and they will check the overall quality of the practices you have identified. One message we would like to pass there is that for us, what is fundamental is the quality much more than the quantity. I hope you had this in mind when you estimated your initial indicator. At the end of the day, we'd like to insist on the word good practices. I'm sure you can learn also from bad practices, from other kind of practices. This is also very useful. However, the one we collect on our program website are the one where there are tangible results behind. They are really the solution maybe other regions are looking for. And what we'd like to, in a way, to summarize it is you may go through during 2 or 3 years of phase 1 of exchange of experience, you may discover a lot of different experiences, practices on the ground. But maybe only 10%, 20%, 30% of them will really be of added value for your partners, for your cooperation. They will be the one that will be really inspire your partners. Maybe part of them will be taken on board in the action plans. And in a way, that's on this kind of practices that we would like you to concentrate, not necessarily having an exhaustive collection of everything you see in your project.
Nico, you mentioned there that the quality is really important and that those being useful for the partnership are those we would like to see submitted. Some of our projects are asking here, what does this mean for the indicator in the application form, the target value of good practices? Because in some cases they were estimated many years ago. Now the projects are working and they realize, okay, we actually have less. And if we are to apply what Nico is now explaining, we may not reach this target value. What advice would you have for these people?
It's a very good question, and without undermining the importance of indicators, we have reduced the number of indicators in Interreg Europe, but we attach a lot of importance to them. However, for this specific element of target value for the good practices, I would really reassure the lead partners and the project that they should not worry too much. In case you realize through this webinar or through the recommendation of the program that in fact you slightly misunderstood, you thought you had to do this exhaustive collection, so you have indicated 30, 40 good practices, and after this webinar you realize at the end of the day I think the one that makes real added value, that brings something to the cooperation will be 10 or 15, you will report the 10 and 15 and you simply explain at the end that the ones that have been the most useful were less than initially anticipated. But you should not be worried not to reach the initial target value. That would be my mistake. Okay. So if we come now to the who can submit good practices, first, very generally, you have to know that you need to be a member of the community. That's the first element. You need to register on our program website to be able to submit a good practice. Then, primarily, what happens is that it's really the project partners and sometimes even the stakeholders that are feeding in this good practice database with their own experience on the ground. But you may not be aware, it's also possible for any member, even not at all involved in any projects, in any Interreg Europe initiative, that is interested by what we are doing, that like to share their knowledge with others, wants to understand better what the others are doing, they can really also submit good practices. This time, the good practice would, of course, not be associated to any particular project. What I'd like to say also, if we go a bit further in who can submit good practices, we have an advice to give you, a recommendation, is that ideally, it should be the good practice owner, the one who submits the good practices. There are several reasons for that. The main one is that if I am the one who have implemented or developed these practices, for sure, I will be the one who knows it best. I can really detail it well. I can say why it was successful. So it's easier for me to describe this practice. The second element why we think it's better that it's the owner is that then your user profile will be associated to these good practices. And of course, if in the course of the policy learning platform activities or the program activities, people want to know more, it's better if they contact the relevant person. This is a theory. We know that the practice is sometimes very different, and it's not always possible for the author to submit the good practices. Sometimes it may be a stakeholder who is really the one implementing the practices, and he doesn't want to be involved. He doesn't want to write in English, for instance. There are a lot of reasons. Sometimes lead partners want also to have a check on what is submitted. So it's also possible for another organization to submit the practices on behalf of the author. The only thing we'd like to highlight there is that at the end of the day, this would still be this user profile, the person who writes it, that will be associated to the good practices. And the last point I'd like also to mention is that be aware that only the members of the platform, of the community, can have access to the contact details of the platform. For the normal users that go on the website, they won't have this detailed information. The last point I wanted to highlight this morning is about the timing and the when. What we want to highlight there is that the good practice submission is completely disconnected from the reporting and from the 6 months report that are submitted to the program. So this is fully an ongoing process. As soon as you are ready, please do not hesitate to start submitting your good practices. It's even better because you may have a workshop in 1 week, or you may have the study visits last week. After the study visits, after this workshop, you may ask the good practice owner or the one in charge of writing the good practices to immediately submit it on the program, and then this will be of course checked, as I mentioned, by the relevant related policy officer. The last thing which is important for you to know in terms of timing is that, however, everything needs to be completed, submitted on the database by the end of phase 1 at the latest. Because you know that at the end of the phase 1, the learning process stops. In principle, we stop identifying, analyzing, disseminating practices, and that's where the program will ask you, okay, where you are with your indicators. And we will ask you at the end of phase 1 to conclude this identification process, this analysis of the good practices. So remember that the last progress report of phase 1 is very important in this regard. So that's where we will ask you to conclude on this good practice submission. That's mainly what I wanted to say about the theory. If there's any immediate question, I would be also happy to answer. Otherwise, I give the floor back.
Okay, I'm having a look at the question box here. I know we had a question from Johanna who was wondering whether it's possible to save the good practice when you're filling out the submission form if you need to come back to it later. I think my colleagues replied already on the chat box, but we can share with the participants that in fact in the handout section you can find a Word document which is the template of the submission form. This means you can prepare it offline and then submit it afterwards by copying and pasting the different fields onto the online form. So this is the solution we have at the moment, because we're talking a bit about whether we might develop a save button, but at the moment it's not the most top priority for the web development. So we may do this in the future. Thanks a lot for the suggestion, but for now we think that the Word document should solve this problem. So we have another question here from James. James is asking, can you provide a time for checking the good practices and informing partners that their good practice has been accepted onto the platform? We have partners in a project that have been waiting for some months to have a reply. So what would be the usual time frame?
It's a good question, and I think this may be tackled also in the second session, maybe on more practicalities. This really depends when it is submitted. What is sure is that at the officer level, we tried within 1 month at least to validate the good practice that have been received. This is a bit our internal objective. It really depends. If we are in the middle of an assessment of a call, or we have received 100 action plans to check, we may sometimes be a bit later. Then this is, if the validation is confirmed, this goes to the policy learning platform. And again, it very much depends on the activities at the platform level, but ideally it should not take longer than another month for being validated. So in case you noticed sometimes very, very low process, which should not be the case, you should not hesitate also to contact your policy officer so you can check. We can check, maybe there was something forgotten in the system, but we can check why this has taken 3 months in your specific case.
Okay, thanks a lot. Then Nico, thanks a lot for all of this interesting information. I'll invite Verena to join us then on the stage, and we'll move from the theoretical part into the more practical details. So what we're going to do now is really show you the validation system and give you some tips. So Verena, welcome.
Thank you.
I'll take your seat.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Also again from my side. Thanks, Eilish, for this. Yeah. The question is then how to do it, how to submit the good practice. As it was mentioned already by Nicolas just earlier, you need to be a member of the community. If you're not yet a member of the community, you can create your account. In order to do so, you go on the Interreg Europe website, and then on the top part you see this button, My Interreg Europe, and this is where you can either connect or create your account to the community. Once you did it, you connected, you see this on your dashboard. We provided you here with a screenshot. You have on the right hand side, you have a tab that leads you to the good practice, and this is basically, well, the overview page of the good practices that you will have submitted. When you click on the button, submit a new good practice, you will actually see the template that you will use and that you will fill in to describe your good practice. First, you will see the author contact information, and this information is basically what you filled in when you created your profile. So it's a link to the user information. So basically, you don't have to change anything there, and if you have to change anything, then you need to do it in the let's say account settings for your user profile. Then we have here a question about the organization in charge of the good practice. So the question would be if you are representing the organization that is actually the owner of the good practice, or that is in charge of the good practice. So if you answer yes, you will so you just select if you're in charge of the good practice, yes or no, and then you can describe the localization of your organization.
So Verena, this is the moment where you can indicate if a different institution actually developed this good practice, right? This
Yes.
is what Nico was saying, that sometimes you might be submitting on behalf of someone else.
Right.
Okay, so this is the way that that institution is made visible.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. Then you come to the, well, general information, the heart of the template, the actual description of the good practice. So first you will give a title of the good practice, and we invite you, of course, to have something, let's say, well, appealing and meaningful even to outsiders. So try to really find a good title of your good practice. And then, well, in your case, we would expect that you answer the following question with yes. So the question, has this good practice been identified in the course of an Interreg Europe project as part of the learning process? So this is very important, because if you don't say yes here, the good practice will, let's say, move on in the system, but it will not be linked to your project, and as a consequence, it will not be visible on your project website. So it means, in return, if the good practice that you're about to describe is indeed, let's say, subject of the analysis of the exchange of experience that you're undertaking in your project, you should say yes here, and then this way we will see it on the website of your project, and it will be accounted in the indicator number of good practices identified. So it's important to link it to the project. You will then be able to select the project from this drop-down menu that appears here. You can, let's say, type in the first letters of your acronym to, well, not to lose time here, let's say, to go through the whole list. And you will also be asked to select the thematic objective of the practice. And actually, more precisely, you should here stick to the specific objective of your project. Sometimes it happens that, let's say, that a specific good practice is a bit maybe in the gray area between two thematic objectives, let's say on the innovation side, between innovation and maybe it also touches the SME topic or whatsoever. So in this case, please stick to the thematic objective under which your project was actually. And then you will also describe the geographical scope of the good practice. So first, the scope in the sense, like, is it something that works on a local level, on regional level, or is it a national-wide, country-wide good practice? And you will geolocalize the good practice. And this information is important here because the localization of the good practice will afterwards be shown on a map. If you're not sure how it looks like, you can just have a look on any good practice that is already available online, and you see how it looks like. And yeah, we would just like to ask you to pay particular attention to this, because well, we had a lot of, let's say, issues when the country or the region wasn't filled in properly. So before you submit the good practice, you may have another look to check if everything is correct here. So then we come to the detailed information, to the actual description. First, we have a short summary. So the text that you fill in here, and it's like 160 characters, so it's very short. It's like a teaser, basically, and it appears like a subtitle to the good practice. And then you will describe, well, the topic. What is the actual problem that the good practice addresses? And you should also describe a little bit the context. And I think what is important to be in mind here is that this good practice is going to be published on your project website, and people that go there and read it, they may not be familiar with either the topic and also not the context of your region. So I think it would be quite important to write it in a way that it's understandable also for outsiders, For instance, if you use a particular jargon or acronyms or abbreviations, you may want to introduce them before you further use them. What's the problem addressed? Yeah, how does the practice reach its objective and how is it implemented basically? So what is actually happening on the ground? Also, what would be interesting to know, who is benefiting from this good practice? So who are the main stakeholders involved there? So this is very, let's say, important information. It's the core of the template, I think, and well, we also put here the character limit. We had to limit it, but I think with 1,500 characters, you can already provide quite a lot of information.
Maybe to add, Verena, Nico was mentioning earlier that a good practice can be, a methodology, an initiative. This is really the core field. Would you agree, where this needs to be conveyed? Because sometimes from the policy officer perspective, we're not always sure what actually the practice is. So would you have any advice on how you can be more specific in this section?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is really important. I mean, this is where you should describe what actually is happening. Like, what is this good practice doing? How is it implemented? What is, like, really to allow an outsider to understand what it's all about. And I mean, also we as a policy officer, we're outsiders most of the time. Unfortunately, we cannot follow in detail all the activities that you're doing. Yeah. So then you move on to the next field, which is about the resources needed. So here we would like to have as specific as possible some insights about the resources that are needed in terms of financial resources. So how much budget is it? But maybe it may also be interesting to know something about the staff resources needed, time resources, and so on. So, and I mean, the more information you can provide, the better, in the sense like maybe you needed much resources to set up the good practice. Let's say it's an incubator, let's say, institution, establishment. You need resources to set it up, but then you need maybe less resources to actually run it. So this type of information would be interesting to know here.
Okay, so it doesn't have to necessarily only be money. It could also be number of staff or staff time or equipment or time needed.
Absolutely,
so different ways of expressing the resources can be accepted.
I think it depends very much on the nature of the good practice and what it's actually about. If you're talking about a funding scheme, like how to finance retrofitting of buildings for more energy efficiency, something like this, I think it would be very interesting to have insight about the actually funding that is available, how long the scheme run, put it in the context so that it's really meaningful and understandable.
Also, for the person who may be interested in trying to replicate this in their region, right? It gives them a sense of what resources they might need to mobilize to do something similar.
Yeah, then you can also provide information about the time scale. So since when is this good practice implemented? Is it still running, or is it maybe a scheme that ended, but it's still valuable to share the experience? So this information you can fill in here in the time scale. And then we come to the evidence of success. And this is very important. It links back a little bit to what Nicola explained earlier. So why is this practice considered as good? So for us, it's a good practice if it showed its success. So we can see that it has some, let's say, reason to exist, reason to talk about it. And yeah, we would like to see it also as specific as possible. So what is the evidence that demonstrated the success? So if you have some indicators that you can rely on, if you have some quantitative information, I think that would be very useful here.
Maybe even the fact that it's been replicated already in the region, or the scheme has been expanded, this can also be a way of explaining that it has been successful. So as Verena says, it's really about demonstrating why this is something worth replicating. Again, what Nico said, that it's really a good practice.
Yeah. And I think we have compiled also some, let's say, just examples of description that we really liked. And I remember there was one good practice from the ratio project, and maybe Etienne can put you the link in the chat box about it, where they also described quite nicely, let's say, the results. Ideally, I mean, sometimes, let's say, you have some figures about the outputs, and it can be very, let's say, impressive. I remember reading one good practice from a project related to urban sustainable transport, and they described, let's say, the bus lane they put in place, and as a consequence of this priority lane for public transport, the travel time decreased very much, and the number of passengers increased very much, and it was really impressive to see it. But then, like, I know that it's not always easy, but at the end of the day, it would be also interesting to see, okay, what impact did that actually have on the CO2 emissions in that city? I mean, so go as far as you can. Let's say the long-term results would be even more interesting, but if you let's say, don't have this data available, at least describe maybe the immediate outputs that that you can have. Yeah, then we have potential for learning or transfer. So yeah, this is really the field that you may be interested in when reading other good practices, so not your own ones, but the one from other partners. Yeah, what is the potential for transfer? Why would it be, let's say, interesting to try it out in other regions, or like, is it feasible to try it out in other regions, or maybe you consider it's very specific to your region, so if other wants to replicate it, they should keep in mind the specific characteristics of your territory. Maybe it was already transferred from one partner region to another. You could also describe this. And then we have also this field about the challenges encountered. So that may be very interesting also for people that want to transfer the good practice, to see, okay, which were the difficulties that you, as the owner of the good practice, encountered when you implemented it for the first time.
Just linking back also to what Nico was telling us earlier about the added value for the partnership, I think this is a very important field where you can explain what your partnership have thought when analysing this practice, because very often we see in the progress reports this specific practice was said to be very interesting because X, Y, and Z, and this is really the heart of what you can put into this kind of field. Why is it interesting, and why did it bring added value to your partner?
Absolutely, yep. Absolutely right. So, sorry, just moving my notes here. No, that's not right. Okay, so then, yeah, as you mentioned, this good practice is going to be published on your project website, and of course you want it to look pretty, you want it to look appealing for the reader, and therefore you should also illustrate it in a way. We know that we're talking most of the time about a bit abstract practices, and it's not very easy always to find appropriate pictures to illustrate it. Therefore, our communication team, they set together an image gallery, so you can select images that are, let's say, available there if you want to. If you don't want to, if you prefer to upload your own picture, that's also absolutely possible. You upload a picture from your device. So we would advise you, let's say, yeah, to have it something that is linked to the good practice. You see here, we put you a screenshot how it looks. We have this small picture there, and when you click on the good practice, it's going to be widen up on the top part of the description of the good practice. Try to have a picture that is not too big in terms of size. I think the recommendation is not more than 1 megabyte, and well, the resolution should be high enough to have it have a nice, let's say, outcome on the page.
Yeah.
So if all these fields are, let's say, filled, if all the steps are taken, you double check that the information is accurate and complete. You can submit your good practice. Before you do so, you can also, sorry, you see it here, and there's also this field about further information and keywords. So further information, you can provide a web page or the link to your organization, or if there's, let's say, I don't know, maybe another document where further information can be found, you can link it there. And you can tag your good practice with certain keywords. So these keywords will help us and will help the users of the community to, let's say, cluster good practices that are talking about similar topics. That will also ease the research in the good practice database. So you can tag several keywords there, and these keywords, you will select them from a drop-down list. Finally, you're ready to submit, so you click on submit. And I will then explain, let's say, the journey of the good practice in the system, in the validation process. But what is important here to say is that then, I mean, it's the same dashboard that I showed you earlier. It was empty. Now, let's say you submitted already a couple of good practices, so you will see them in the dashboard, each good practice, the related topics, so the specific objective from the project acronym, the submission date, and the status. And the status is very important later on to follow up on the validation process. Okay, do we have questions so far on this, or?
We have a few questions, yes. Somebody is asking, so Katarina is asking a bit about the identification of the geographical scope. So she's wondering if a good practice is related to a regional policy, but it can also be replicated in other regions. How should they fill out this? So if the good practice is related to regional policy, but it can be replicated in other regions, how should it be considered in terms of geographical scope?
Well, I think in this case you should fill in, let's say, the localization of where the practice was for the first time implemented, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would fill it out at regional level. This is an initiative that has been proven successful at regional level. So I think the context where it was first implemented would be the right level to fill out.
Yeah, I agree.
We have a question also about what is the role of the lead partner in the good practice submission process?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I will answer it when I go through the slides, actually. Maybe we can move on in this respect.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah? Okay. Because now we're going to talk about the validation process. This is how it looks like. A lot of steps here. So basically, you at the good practice also, and I mean, as we said, you need to be connected to the community, a member of the community. You will describe your good practice, submit it. Once it's submitted, it's going to pop up in the dashboard of the project website administrator. So, I mean, now some of you, the Force Code project, you may not be familiar with all this yet because your project website has not been released yet, but you will get more information very soon. But I mean, for sure, like the other projects that are running already, you have your website in place and you know how it works, and you have appointed at least one website administrator. It can be the lead partner, but it's not always the lead partner. I mean, sometimes it's also, let's say, the partner that is in charge of project communication. And some projects even decided to share this task. So the website administrator has a very important role here because he's gonna read the good practice, and he's like, let's say, first filter in the sense like you are responsible and you have the authority about what is published on your project website. So you may want to read, to go through it, to see if it's understandable on a general level, if it's in English, because it should be in English, if there are no, let's say, typos, if the picture looks pretty, and if there's no bugs in there, if the localization is filled in correctly, and so on. So, so the role of the website administrator is quite important here. Once the website administrator approves the good practice, it's going to continue to the dashboard of the policy officer. So the policy officer from the JS, so Eilish, me, and our colleagues, according to the project, we will read your good practice, and we will, we will also assess it in a certain way, in the sense that, I mean, sometimes you will see, okay, maybe it's not in English, or maybe there's a lot of information missing, or the picture doesn't look great, or whatsoever. So there may be cases where we will go back to the author and ask you, could you maybe improve it, because we think that there's, let's say, can look better on your project website. And if we really like the good practice, if we, let's say, see some potential, or we think, okay, this is something we want also our semantic experts to be aware of, to comment on it, to maybe put it in link with other good practices and so on. So we would then forward it to the semantic expert of the policy learning platform. And they will also read it. And they would then, most of the time, they would, let's say, publish it also on the good practice database linked to the policy learning platform, and they would provide their comment, their input. So they would say, okay, there's one aspect that we think is really worth highlighting, or like we want to draw particular attention to this aspect.
So less of a detailed critical analysis, but more of a comment that highlights a specific feature that's useful for the reader.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, it's interesting because it may even happen that also the thematic expert, they may go back to the author, to you, to request further information, or they may also, let's say, take this as a starting point then to further explore it and maybe invite you to a platform event, to an online discussion, or like, I mean, they may also, let's say, use it and further analyze it, so further work with it, but I mean, then of course you will be informed about it, and it will be a very good thing, because then, let's say, the work of your project will be even further showcased on program basis. So yeah, I hope I answered the question. Now, what is the role of the lead partner? Meaning, like, the lead partner does not necessarily have a specific role here. The only thing that is important to be kept in mind is that the lead partner is responsible of the reporting towards the secretariat, and about the indicator and number of good practices identified. So you should, let's say, try to find a way to keep an overview here. The easiest would be indeed that yourself also you assign you as web administrator, so that you have the overview on the dashboard about the good practices that have been submitted for your project.
Maybe we could add that, I mean, there can be several web administrators allocated to each project. So in some cases, the lead partner has asked to be added as a web admin, so that they can also track the process, even if it would be another person who will actually ensure that the criteria is met. So it's really up to the lead partner to take on this web administrator role.
Yeah, and then as mentioned also earlier by Nico, I mean, sometimes in some projects they decided that it's the lead partner is going to fill in all the good practices, but let's say that's not exactly the way we imagine it. We would really prefer that the owners of the good practice, so the different partners or the different stakeholders fill in the good practice. Yeah.
Maybe Verena, we have a question here from Dimitrios. He's saying he sees that there are 3 different validation stages. This means that a good practice can appear on the website, but then be later rejected. Is this the case?
Yes, it is the case, but I mean, I think it's quite rare. Like, it would be a pity to ask you to reject good practices. Usually we don't do that. I mean, if, for instance, if we as a policy officer, we would ask you to remove the good practice, then it would be really because we see a major issue, or we really don't see the link to the project, or I don't know.
It doesn't seem to be actually a good practice, or the quality of the information is so poor. So
yeah.
I think in a moment you're going to tell us some of the common mistakes or common issues that we find in validation. So this should help avoid this situation.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it can happen, but I think it's quite rare. It's really an exception, and then maybe just to finish on this validation process, I mean, it's more, let's say, for your information. So, because you see now on the screen on the left hand, there's also the, let's say, scenario where the good practice also is not connected to a project. I mean, it was mentioned earlier that the database of good practices is also filled in by good practices that do not come directly from the project, that come from the members of the community. In this case, obviously, the steps are skipped, and the steps of validation through the project website admin and the JS policy officer, and the good practice comes directly to the thematic expert. Yeah, but this is again basically also to say that the link of your good practice to the project is really, really important here.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we would not see it, we as policy officers, and it wouldn't appear on your project website. Common pitfalls. Basically, the question that was asked earlier, this is the cases where the policy officer would get back to you as they also, or I mean, ideally even the website admin would do that, but if the website admin did not do it, we would do it. For instance, if we do not see the link of the good practice to the topic of the project, if we think that the let's say the information that you compiled there is not really fitting the criteria of a good practice, the definition of a good practice, so you're more reporting on some general progress that is made in the project. Like, we had a few cases like this, then it's also we would reject it indeed. And also we had a few cases where people described, let's say, more an upcoming strategy or theory or proposal, project proposal, something like this, but there was nothing that showcased, okay, this was already implemented on the ground, and there's at least some first successes visible. So if there's none of this, then we would also not accept the good practice sheet. And then it can be, of course, happen that we think that some of the main features are not described in enough detail, so we don't have information about the evidence of success. We don't have information about the resources needed, this type of issues, where we're saying, okay, it sounds interesting, it sounds, let's say, there's potential, but we would like to see more information, more concrete information. Then it may also happen that we get back to you as you also ask you, maybe you can improve this specific part. I don't know, provide more quantitative information about the evidence of success or so on. And then it also happened, we had a few cases where we weren't quite sure about the nature of the good practice, because what was described was more, let's say, an initiative from a private company.
Verena, maybe on this point, I know in my experience I have some projects where several good practices have originated in the private sector. What could we advise the projects who might find themselves in this situation? Does it mean that the good practice can't be accepted?
Well, it depends a little bit. It's not, let's say, it's not always black and white. For me, let's say what is important to see is that the good practice that you described can inspire or did inspire some public authorities, some policymakers. So if it's something that is really purely private sector, it's a bit difficult. But if it's something that could be replicated or initiated by a public authority, I think there's still some interest to publish it.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, the added value for a public authority is what's critical in all of these good practices.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah. And that is one important piece of information for those of you that are involved maybe in different projects, and you may even be involved in different projects with different roles, meaning that you may be a regular user, so a simple good practice author, on the one hand in one project, and on the other project you may be the project administrator or the lead partner or both. So you can have different roles. So when you connect to your dashboard in the community, you have on the right top corner, you have this field where you can toggle between the different roles, and this will allow you to see the good practices that are assigned to you or that are linked to your account. You will not be able to switch between the different projects as such, but I mean, you can switch between the different roles you have. Yes, I think that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a question, Verena. Chiara is asking, if there is a mistake or something not clear enough in the good practice, do we have an opportunity to correct it?
Yes, so it depends a little bit on the status of the good practice. So where's the good practice in the validation process? So meaning if it's under validation from the web administrator or from the policy officer or from the platform expert, you will not be able to edit the good practice. Otherwise, you will be able to, you can always access it if it's validated, or if it's, you can always access this and correct or update. You may also want to update the description or provide more recent information.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to that question. There's also the fact, I mean, if in the validation process the policy officer has an issue that the evidence of success is not clear enough, we can actually go back and say, can you please explain this section in more detail? And in this case, you would get a notification to your email, also on your dashboard, that something needs to be corrected, and you will see exactly the issue explained. So both if in the validation process something needs to be changed, or if afterwards you discover a mistake or you want to update something, there are opportunities to do both.
Yeah.
Verena, maybe some of our participants here are feeling that the process is very complicated and tricky and they're never going to manage to get a good practice accepted. What do you think?
Well, I hope they will do, because in reality we have already quite some good practices in the database.
Yeah.
So.
In fact, we'd like to ask you your opinion. We have a little poll for you here. How many good practices do you think have already passed through these steps and reached publication in the good practice database? So I would ask Josephine to launch the poll and give us your best guess. For sure we have a couple of hundred, but we'd be interested to see what you think.
Yeah, maybe for the anecdote, we did this survey yesterday in the team also, and yeah, some of the colleagues were quite surprised about the good number. So
yeah, and I hope you're not cheating now and checking the good practice database, because this is a very honest guessing exercise. So Verena, the majority,
there's no prize.
No prize. The majority of people are guessing that we've over 500 good practices in the database.
Yeah, true. Yeah. But we have even more.
Yeah. So as of yesterday, we had 762, and we're counting on you now to help us bring us up to an even greater number. We really want to stand out as a program with a really well-evidenced collection of good practices. So I think, do you have more points that you want to share with us, Verena, or should we move to questions and answer? I think you have some.
I prepared, let's say, like one slide with the key points to remember. Yes. So first point to remember is the connection of the good practice to your project acronym. So as I showed earlier in the good practice template, one of the first questions is it linked to the project, yes or no? So you say yes and you select your project. Yeah, then it's important to know that the good practice is indeed a good practice in the sense that it proved its success, and you should describe it. In general, the information you provide should be clear, meaningful, understandable for outsiders. Quality over quantity. That means, yeah, you should be, let's say, selective in a certain way. I think Nico explained it earlier. Only really describe those good practices that are subject to analysis in the good practice. In the policy learning and the exchange of experience. Ideally, the good practice author should be the owner, as explained, in the way that on the one hand you have a mandate, let's say, to publish information about the good practice, but also in the sense that you would be able to answer, for instance, question if someone wants to contact you, because as it was also explained, your contact details are linked to this good practice and it's visible to the community members on the website. Yeah, last but not least, submit your good practice anytime before the last progress report of phase 1. But in fact, we would really advise you to do it the sooner. I mean, as soon as possible, as soon as you can, or at least start as soon as you can. So I think the idea would also to have a bit of a continuous submission, and that would also basically avoid bottlenecks on our side. It was mentioned earlier that sometimes the validation was pretty much delayed. So obviously, if you submit 20 good practices in one go, it may take us a bit more time to check them all, but if you submit them like 2 or 3 and then another 2 or 3 months later, it would be easier for us to follow up on this also, I guess. So that was basically the key points I wanted to make. I don't know if I forgot something or...
No, I think we have still some questions that might help us add more information. Maybe for all of you to know, we're planning to end this webinar at around 11. At the moment, we don't have so many questions being asked, but if you have some issues that you would like us to clarify, now's your chance. Please write to us in the questions box and we will do our best to give you the answers. If not, we follow up by email. I can already maybe dive into some of the questions here. So Mercedes is asking, Verena, how long since a good practice has ended? Is it possible to present a good practice that finished, for instance, in 2013? So does it have to have a specific recent nature to be a good practice?
It's funny that this question raised because I don't know if you remember, we discussed it actually yesterday when we prepared a little bit for this webinar. We don't have, let's say, there's no rule or recommendation on it. For what I would say, common sense. If you think that this good practice is still valid to be shared in the sense that it's still interesting, even though it's already outdated a little bit, just convince us about it. I mean, describe it in a way that we understand why it's still relevant, and then there wouldn't be an issue. But I mean, then of course I would be a bit surprised to see a good practice that ended in, I don't know, 2000. I mean, let's say it should be reasonable.
Yeah. Mercedes is following up to say that in this case there would not be updated information since 2013. I think what would be important is to see that it's still somehow been useful for the learning process. So maybe coming back to this field, the potential for learning and transfer, you can explain that even though it's a few years outdated, this aspect is still seen as very relevant for the partnership. So it's really up to you to justify in the way you describe the practice that it's still a good practice worth sharing. Just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it's not worth sharing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Madeleine is asking, when is the last progress report to phase 1? Because we've mentioned it several times that the good practices have to be submitted by then.
So, I mean, let's say I can't tell you a date now because also I don't know on behalf of which project you're asking this question, but in general, I mean, you know, the project is split into phases, phase 1 and phase 2, and the last progress report of phase 1 is due 3 months after the end of phase 1. Yeah, I hope this answers your question. If you need more specific information, don't hesitate to write us an email and we will check then, like indicate the project on which you're working, and then we will follow up in more detail.
Okay, we have a question from Michael saying he wants to submit a good practice which was developed by SMEs, the adoption of a Industry 4.1 solution. It is inspiration for us because it shows that solutions can improve a whole branch of industry. Can we submit it? So this is maybe a question, could this be considered as a good practice?
Can you, what was exactly the initiative about?
I think it's the adoption
developed
of
by the SMEs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say why not? I mean, again, if it fits, if it meets our criteria.
Yeah, it may be a private initiative in this case.
Exactly, that was what I was about to say. Again, like if it's a private initiative, also show us in how far it's something that can inspire or something that involves the public authorities.
Okay. Verena, do you have any good examples of a good practice that you particularly liked? Maybe one that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I mentioned already earlier the one from Manchester about the bus lane they introduced, so give priority to the public transport, and I think they decreased the travel time from the suburban areas to the city center by, I don't know, more than 10 minutes. And I thought that was really amazing because I don't know if you take public transport on a daily basis, but I mean, it's quite impressive to see this. And well, apparently they managed really to increase also the number of passengers, and hopefully these people don't take the private cars anymore. So yeah, that was something I really liked. And I mean, we have plenty of good examples, plenty of interesting good practices. It's really exciting actually to browse through the database. I think our colleagues can also just give links to a few good practices we really liked, but there's really, really many, and I invite all of you to go through it and read a few, get inspired, share them with your partners, and of course fill in your own good practices.
Yeah, Probably having a look at what's already published in the good practice database would be a good tip before you start developing your own good practices, because you can see the level of detail which is required. Also the way the evidence of success and the resources is described in different contexts, this might be useful. Verena, how can our projects get help if they have a question about whether something is a good practice, or if they have any difficulties using the system? Who can they contact?
Yeah, of course we're available to answer all the questions. I think if you have questions about the content of the good practice, if you're not sure if it should be filled in or what information exactly to provide, you can, maybe discuss first with the partners, with the lead partner, but of course you can also contact your policy officer in the JS. And if you have questions more on the technical side, or if you have something in the system that doesn't work the way it should, you can contact our colleagues in the communication team. They will try to help you as much as they can.
Nika is asking, how long within project implementation does it normally take to identify a good practice? Maybe this means in what stage of the project, maybe in which semester do we start to see the good practices being reported? Yeah,
that's an interesting question. I think there's no, let's say, crystal clear answer, because it depends very much on the approach that your project is following. So in general, and most of the time, the projects end up with the identification of good practice in, let's say, in the semester 2 or 3 maybe, so rather early stage. But sometimes it's also they go, okay, we start with some in-depth analysis of the first good practices, we do the study with it, but they continue to do that until almost the end of phase 1. So it depends a little bit on the process and the approach that you have to the learning.
Nika is also asking if we have any suggestions about how to identify good practices.
Well, if I have suggestions how to identify good practices, generally, I think it's something that you probably exchange with your partners even before you hand it in the application form. There may be different approaches. I know that some projects, they really go to, first all the partners come with, let's say, a very long list of everything that they think might be of added value, might be of interest. So they, let's say, have a first screening of good practice that they have available, they are aware of. And then they discuss with the partners and they see, okay, this is, let's say, not particularly interesting, this is definitely not transferable whatsoever, this doesn't fit the needs of the partner. So they do then a second filter. Others, they may be more selective from the very beginning. There can be different ways. I don't know if you have more suggestions, Eilish.
Yeah, I think a good tip could be to check out maybe the library folders on the websites of the more advanced projects, maybe the first call, second call projects, because they often post their methodology documents, so how they have identified the good practices, how they have worked to create different matrices, to see what has been useful on the territory and what can be transferred. So there's different ways that you can do this. Generally, it's described in some level of detail in your application form, but there is inspiration available from other projects. I'd recommend, if you're really facing an obstacle with this, maybe contact your policy officer and discuss it in more detail to see how it could be applied in your context specifically.
Now that you say this, Eilish, something else comes to my mind.
I
think we have also this Google Drive where we collect, we call it resources for project or something like this. There's also, we upload some templates or from our side, from the secretariat side, but it's also the place where some projects shared their methodology or type of guidelines or something like this. Maybe we can provide the link to this in the chat. I'm not sure if they have it, but if not, feel free really to contact us and we will send it to you by email also.
Okay. Again, we have the question, how long on average does it take to get the expert validation, particularly in TO3?
In TO3. Nico mentioned earlier, usually it should not take more than 1 month. I have to apologize because I also know in other, in TO3 and also in other TOs, we had some bottlenecks in the past, so I know the experts are now catching up. Usually it should not take longer than 1 month.
I think if there's a specific delay, you can contact your policy officer to flag the issue, and they can explain if there's a particular reason behind it or when you could expect to receive the validation. But it's worth mentioning also that it's not guaranteed that the good practice will ultimately be published in the good
Yeah.
practice database. A lot of them are. I think around 90% of those that are accepted by the policy officer are ultimately published. But then the work of the thematic expert is really to analyze it and see, is this something that they think can be useful for any policymaker in Europe? And then they would provide their comment highlighting a feature of what would be particularly interesting. But in any case, if it will not be published, you will still get a notification telling you this. So either way, you should have news within 1 month of submitting it. Mercedes is asking, do the good practices presented have to be connected to the study visits, or can we present good practices coming from outside the partner regions?
Yes, so do they have to be linked to the study visits? Ideally, yes. So I would, let's say, I would expect that all the study visits, trigger some good practices. Then maybe you have even more good practices that you could not visit, or they were not subject to study visits. So in principle, yes. And then the second question, can we identify good practices from outside the partner regions? This is a bit more tricky. Like we would not necessarily advise you to do that, simply because, I mean, first of all, in Interreg Europe, I mean, the idea is really that the partners that work on the project exchange the experience they do have. And in 99% of the cases, the partners do have already a lot of experience they can put on the table. So they don't necessarily need to look for good practices outside the partner regions. Then we had cases, and every now and then we face cases where in very well justified situations, they told us, okay, we know from our partner region or another region, our country, they are really front runner in this specific aspect. They have this particular good practices we are really interested in, and we have already a lot of information available. So we will also include it in our good practice, let's say, analysis and so on. So yeah, it's possible, but it's definitely not the way we would expect you to usually go.
Okay. I think we're coming to the end now. I see one more question coming in, but I think we will close after that. We will be able to answer to any last questions either in the chat room after we end the webinar, or else we will follow up by email. Just to repeat that, yes, the slides are available. They're in the handouts folder. Yes, the recording will be available online. We're going to provide you the link to the Google Drive folder where you can find those methodological documents about how other projects are doing the identification of good practices. And here we have final question. Can a good practice be counted towards the indicator in the progress report if the policy officer validates it, but ultimately the thematic expert does not publish it?
Yes.
The answer is yes. So, I mean, the publication in the good practice database is more about collecting this bank of knowledge, making visible the most outstanding good practices, but separately there's the process managed by the policy officer of checking, is it a good practice and can it be counted? So the two are detached in a way.
Exactly. I mean, the experts from the policy learning platform, they're not involved in anything that touches to the project monitoring as such. And I mean, monitoring this indicator is really something that we do at the secretariat level.
Okay. All right. Well then, I mean, I think we would like to thank you very much. You've been quite active. Thanks for asking all of your questions and for participating in our polls. I'd like to thank my colleague Verena for helping here with the content today. Also Nico, who had to leave us, Hassan and Etienne on the chat box, who you've been talking to, and of course Josephine, who's been helping us really, really preciously with the technicalities.
Thanks for being a great host.
Thanks a lot. My pleasure, my job. So we hope that you enjoyed the webinar. Please do give us your feedback if there's anything we can do better next time. And don't hesitate to get in touch with your policy officer for any content issues on the good practices, or with your communication officer if you have any technical problems. And yeah, we look forward to receiving your good practices and pushing that number up towards 1,000.
Yes.
So we wish you a very good day. Thanks a lot and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Bye.